shall not fail the child. Oh dear me, the child, it's still alive. And what's that? A sword? It must have belonged to the baby's father. It's a fine weapon. Perhaps Fulte will have a use for it.
Albert Odyssey Legend of Eldean was released on July 31st, 1997, exclusively for the SEGA Saturn. It was published in North America by Working Designs, that awesome studio behind so many classic games. If you don't know who Working Designs were, they were basically Xseed and NIS America before those companies existed. They used to take Japanese games that no publisher would touch and translate them for North American audiences. They actually started out releasing games on the TurboGrafx-16 before moving on to the Sega CD and eventually the Sega Saturn. Albert Odyssey was their fifth and second to last game released on the Saturn. Well, that is, if the dates I can find corresponding to release dates are correct, that is. In total, Working Designs made 6 games for the Saturn, and most of them are excellent. Working Designs was the type of company where you knew you were playing one of their games. The dialogue was always cheeky and funny, and this game is no different. While purists will say the dialogue strays far from what the original developers intended, I never saw the harm considering so many of these games never had other iterations released on this side of the pond. In reality, Albert Odyssey was actually in development by Sunsoft for the Super Famicom before it was cancelled and switched platforms late in development. You can tell too because there are many elements that highlight the 16-bit RPG feel, but I'll touch upon those soon. Legend of Eldean is actually a side story to the main series and was the first non-tactical strategy RPG. It featured a lot more backstory on certain characters but remained largely independent from the main series. So when Working Designs got their hands on the game, they changed most of the connections to the series that no one knew about, and that's why I say more or less I'm fine with what they did. The story begins with Pike's family being killed when he's just an infant. He is rescued and raised in a harpy village until 10 years later when a powerful foe riding a dragon steals the town's prayer crystal and turns his adoptive sister to stone. Pike goes off on a journey to find a cure for his sister, but before too long discovers there's a sinister plot at work whereby a group of evil sorcerers are trying to resurrect an ancient god and destroy all life as we know it. Pike and his friends are the only ones powerful enough to stop this madness. Okay, so the story is fairly cliche by today's standards, but it's interesting nonetheless, and is broken down into 2 main chapters. While I prefer the first chapter because it's all about Pike discovering the badass he'll eventually become, when the second one is more straightforward standard fare, rescue the universe, blah blah blah. There's a large cast of characters and each is fully fleshed out with a detailed backstory. This is exactly what you'd expect from a traditional RPG. And if you enjoy the overall storyline, you'll surely love what Working Designs did with each character's motivations for joining the larger group. I love how you have dialogue choices even during the most serious conversations, and while the choices almost always don't matter, they sure make for some welcome comic relief. The gameplay is where some of the 16-bit roots start to shine through. Unlike most RPGs of the time, you don't go from town to dungeon to town. Here you typically visit 2 towns before making your way to a dungeon, and dungeons aren't anywhere near as well designed as the towns or world map. And I have to admit I was disappointed back when I first played the game. The difficulty spike in the dungeons is also very odd. The first 3/4 of the game you can breeze through with no problems whatsoever. But then the ending will take hours upon hours to try and figure out, and if you haven't grinded, you're gonna be in for a hard time. And I just thought that was always really bizarre. Towns and the overworld map are excellently designed, featuring lush and beautiful graphics. Honestly, the game just looks fantastic in those areas, but dungeons can be a bit barren by comparison. The combat system is exceedingly basic. You can have up to 5 party members at once, which is nice, but the combat is very simple. You can defend, use magic, items, basic attacks, or run away. Magic attacks are mostly weak unless you use the extremely MP consuming abilities, and not all characters learn healing spells either, so you'll have to strategize which members you want to cast as DPS and which as healers. Combat itself is like most RPGs of the time, random encounter based. Even though working designs say they decrease the encounter rate, I still find it really high. When I played it again to capture this footage, it felt like every few steps I would get sucked into battle. The battle screens also look really dated, and they take about 2 seconds too long to load in and out. And yet this is another area that working designs improved upon the Japanese release, but I just found it just wasn't quite enough. After you play for a few hours, you will get used to them, but I was just always hoping they'd be just a bit faster. The battle screens also look really basic compared to the rest of the game. The backgrounds are dull, static backdrops, and the enemies don't animate nearly as much as they should for a 32-bit game. If the battle screens were as beautiful as some of the towns, this would have been a must-have RPG on the Saturn. And well, since there are so few RPGs on the North American Saturn, it kinda already is. So while the graphics can be a mixed bag depending on whether you're talking about the world map and towns or the battle screens and dungeons, the music is a knockout all around, I found. I really enjoyed the sound effects and the soundtrack itself. There's even some voice acting in the opening cinematics, which was surprising, as I honestly didn't remember them. Albert Odyssey, The Legend of Eldean, is one of only a few RPGs released on the Saturn in North America. It's such a shame Bernie Stoller was working for Sega at this point in time, as he was the main reason Working Designs left Sega and became a PlayStation exclusive publisher shortly after this game's release. Sega should have highlighted every Working Designs game out there, as they were all exclusive. But alas, that never happened, and Magic Knight Ray Earth, which was released after this game in 1998, would be their last game. This is a very easy game to recommend for the Saturn and for RPG fans alike. Although you have to be warned that the North American version goes for well over $100 on eBay these days, with prices continuing to climb. Just know that if you ever do find a copy for a decent price, you should most certainly jump on it and enjoy a truly fun RPG.